Okay, guys, we're going to get started. So this is the first time I've given a lecture without a mask in 3 years. It's kind of good, kind of scary, a little bit liberating. Okay, I want to start. We're going to look at some past examples of sunny. Big day today, just like every other day in this class, but we're actually going to do some work on her. Your assignment for this coming week is to actually redo Sunny. So that's that girl. We're going to do some of that in class today, and then a whole bunch of other things. But at any rate, so we're going to get started on your homework today. Aren't you happy? Yes. So I'm going to start again in no particular order. I'm not pointing this out to anybody. This is actually one of Alex's. And so typically if I take a look through here, what I try to do is I turn off the background layer just so I can see what all the masks look like stacked up. In a perfect world, you would actually end up recreating the image. There's a caveat to that, but it should be relatively close. The caveat to it is this. If you take a look at this edge right here, there's a reason that this does not perfectly fit. We'll talk about what that reason is in a little bit, but I got to put it on my list. However, in this case right here, this is a little extreme in this case in terms of that sort of dovetailing part. And the thing that you sort of should realize in this is that your masks can help you refine other masks. So if I take a look at just his hair mask right here, you can see that there's a lot of open area in here. And then if I take a look at just the skin mask, you can see that it's not allowing that skin to come through the way it actually had come through before. So again, the sort of delineation between skin and hair exists in this particular mask right here, but it doesn't exist in the skin one, which is this one right here. So I'm going to try to fix that. So again, I think that there's a mistake with this mask. It's not really complete. But if I come up to the hair mask and I command click onto the hair mask, that actually loads this as a selection. And then I'm going to come back to work on this skin alone. So this is just the skin one alone. And you can see I've got an active selection going now. I'm not entirely certain whether this is the correct selection or the inverse of it, but we can find out. Also, I'm going to hit the D key to default my foreground and background colors to black and white. I want the skin in this part of the area where it should be skin to actually show through. So on this mask right now, those areas are black. That's why they have actually been hidden. That's why I don't see them here. So I know that I need to paint with white on this mask. This is what the mask itself looks like. And you can see there are areas that it has selected in here. Again, it's impossible to say with the marching ants what really is selected and what's really not, but the minute you start to work on it, you'll know you're either in the right area or you're not in the right area. So I'm going to go back to my image right here. However, I am working on the layer mask. I am going to be painting with white. I'm going to grab a brush. You shouldn't have to worry too much about the edge of your brush or the hardness of your brush, because the selection itself should be taking care of where you actually are painting and where you aren't painting. You just need to make sure that your brush is in a normal blending mode, 100% opacity, 100% flow. And then I'm simply going to start working in this area. And now you can see the mask, the selection itself it's the wrong one. It's inverted. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. Then up to the select menu down to inverse, and that should select the opposite. And then again, I'm still working with white on this skin layer, and I'm going to come into here, and you can see it starts to pull in more of the skin. You can hit it repeatedly depending on how this all goes. And then again, I can hit these areas around here. So Command D to deselect. So this is where I got, which actually I think is a little bit more of a mask in here as opposed to Well, here I can show it to you. We'll just do a snapshot of this, and then I'll go back in time and do a snapshot of that. And then if we go back and forth, you can see I'm already using the stuff that Alex had already made to go ahead and refine this mask a little bit further. So just realize that that's something that's going on in all of this. And I realize that this is really your first foray into this stuff, so I'm just trying to show you the things that I would recommend that you check out and ways to actually look at your image and ways to troubleshoot stuff. And then we will actually go through that whole process when we actually go to work on Sunny ourselves. So the next one I want to take a look at is Amanda's. And in this one, again, I'm going to do the same trick, turn off the background. You can see that I've got issues that are happening up in here in this whole area that's actually up in here. So one of the things that I can't strongly suggest enough for you guys to do is to actually look at the masks by themselves. So what that means is I'm going to hover over this blue background mask right now. I'm going to hold down the Option key and click on it, and that just shows me that mask by itself. So I'm not looking at I'm just looking at the mask that's actually on there. And as I'm looking around in here, you can actually see, I'm looking at my color readouts here up in my info palette, that this area up in here is actually reading positive. It's reading a 248, and that means I've got tone in this. So it needs to be cleaned out. If I go back and then zoom into this area right here, it's really hard to sort of see that this isn't a pure white. You get the feeling that it actually is. I'm going to invert this mask. Command I will actually invert it, and then you can actually see some of the lighter garbage that's actually in here, and I can tell that this mask hasn't been completed. It actually needs some brush work in here to clean this out. We'll actually look at other areas where we see more of that in just a second. And go back to see what this looked like in the beginning. I'm going to turn everybody else off except for that. So I spot things like this, and you can see that there's an issue right here with, again, on a lot of the responses that I sent to you guys, I spoke a lot about contamination in your masks. What that means is that there's areas in here that are not as clean as they actually should be. So right now we're actually looking at the sweater part. So I'm going to take a look at its mask by itself. Again, hold down the Option key and click on the mask. And you can see right here that there's been a lot of work in here that's done with it's probably been done with a brush, possibly with a selection tool or something like that. But you can spot this a mile away. So you see it's a really soft edge here, but it's a much harder edge right there. So it's little things like that that I begin to look for. I'm going to take a look at Michaela's really quick. So in this one, when you turn off the background layer, things actually look reasonably good. There's a little bit of, the dovetailing here is not, typically when you see this problem right here, it's a real consistent line. It's not broken up like this. But that's not why I wanted to show you the picture. This is the reason I wanted to actually show you the picture. You can see that this mask here starts to actually get torn apart and sort of like fall apart. And so when that happened, I was just like, okay, what is really going on here? I want to take a look at this. So I'm going to show you the hair by itself. And I'm going to do it in the blue layer, I think. Yeah. So I'm on the blue layer right here, and it gets to be really hard to see with its. I mean, it's correct in the sense that the black part of the image is hiding the figure. It's showing the blue background. However, if you zip up in here, you can sort of see some of the checkerboarding Yeah, you can see it here. Some of the checkerboarding is starting to come through here. Again, that's telling me that this mask it's not complete. There's tone in this. If I hover over, I'm going to click on the mask itself and hover over this area, you can see my readouts. I'm getting in the 230s, 240s, something like that. That's explaining what's really going on here. However, like I said, it's really hard to see because what we're looking at, we can't see because it's hidden. So to just check the mask, I'm going to invert this mask again. So again, I've got the brackets around the mask. Command-I will actually invert it. And then you can sort of spot what's actually going on in here. And in my sense of what's happening in here is that this mask is actually pretty aggressive in here. It's tearing apart a lot of this hair in here. When you look at it, see if there's anything else. There isn't anything else on. It's just the mask itself is too sharp. Let me see if we get one in the hair, if that looks easier to see. I'll go ahead and invert this guy as well. No, it's not easier to see. It says here the skin mask. Let me take a look at him. Oh, yeah, this is where you can sort of spot it here. In terms of the aggressiveness of the mask, when we talk about it being too aggressive, you can see that there's no real subtle transition that's happening from here, from her skin into her hair. It's really, really, really this choppy line, and this should actually all be a sort of like a softer, easier transition part into it. It's just a way of looking at these guys, and again, thinking about how hard. I think typically when you get masks that are too aggressive, what's happening is that when you go to do the levels adjustment, once you've actually made the initial mask itself, and you're trying to push the background to white and the foreground or the figure to black, the levels adjustment gets to be too strong. That's usually where it is. So take a look at Evans next. And in here, you can see what's really gone wrong is that this is essentially a hand-painted mask. So if we take a look at it, there's none of the fine hair in here. There's none of the real easy transition in here. All of this actually just looks painted into this. And that's what we're trying to get away from. We're trying to actually get the image to build the masks for us. Based on luminosity, not actually us having to go in and do handwork in there to actually try to pull all of this stuff out. Take a look at Caitlin's next. And this may be where I think one of these I just remember seeing the mask itself was just, yeah. This is a perfect example of when I say it's too aggressive. So if you take a look at this, you would say that, oh, well, okay, that's gotten all those beautiful little fine hairs. The problem is that all of those little beautiful fine hairs are supposed to have some transparency to them. And if we take a look at her layer mask right here, you can see there's no transparency in that at all. All of this is perfectly white here. This is too aggressive on this edge right here. And that's why it gives us, it almost looks, this looks like straw to me. It does not look like fine hair, and that's actually the problem. And you can see you pick up an enormous amount of spill. Spill is this blue color that's actually in here. We're gonna talk about how to get rid of that part today. But again, it's just the mask here is too aggressive. This should be finer hair. It should have some transparency in it. It just should be, this just got stepped on too hard. And finally, I want to show you Olivia's. And again, we'll turn off the base here. And in this one, this was actually probably the best one of this semester that actually got turned in. You can see that there's a subtle dovetailing problem right here. Again, that's to be expected. That's not something we can get rid of. There's another one that's happening along right here, but all in all, these the majority of the elements here, this part actually ended up being very well done. Yes, Caitlin?
So we should not go in and try and clean up the dovetailing? Like the little line in between?
You'll see what we're, it depends on what you're ultimately going to do with it. If you're actually trying to separate something to put onto a different background, like you're doing a complete knockout, then yes, you do need to clean up the dovetailing. If you're, only going to do like a tonal correction or a color or recoloring or that kind of stuff, whatever, your selection doesn't have to be as perfect, and you'll see that today. Yes?
So can you follow up? So for when we're reviewing this, should we not clean up the depth?
Well, I'm going to show you first off why it exists, because the truth of the matter is it's not, initially I used to label this as a bug in Photoshop, but it actually isn't a bug. So to show you what the dovetailing problem is, I need everybody to do this with me. I'm going to close this up. I want you to just create a brand new file. Command N is the keyboard shortcut for it. If you can't remember that, it's up to the File menu down to New, and we're just going to do a new file. I'm going to use my drop-down menu. Again, I use the older new dialog box, so if your dialog box doesn't look like this, you're on your own. This is something we set up in preferences on the very first day we were in this class. I'm just going to do mine as an 8 by 10, so I'm going to do it 10 inches wide by 8 tall, and I'm going to do it as 300 pixels per inch, 8-bit color, and I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. So I'm going to invert this background color. I'm going to start with black. So to do that, just, I take that back. Let's copy it first. So I'm going to copy this background layer, Command J. That'll make a copy of it. Then I'm going to invert that copy, Command I. So we've now got a black layer sitting on top of a white layer. And I'm going to drag out a selection using the rectangular marquee tool. So I'm grabbing the marquee tool, the rectangular one. Make sure that you have 0 feathering in the options panel that's up at the top, and that your style is set to normal. And then I'm just going to click and drag out a square or a rectangle in the middle. It doesn't necessarily, the size of this doesn't really matter so much. So just roughly a rectangle like this. And I'm going to jump that to its own layer, Command J. If you turn off now the middle layer, what you basically have is you've got a black square that's actually sitting on a white field. Has everybody who's doing this gotten this far? Okay, I want to make the opposite of this now. So to get to the opposite, if you hover over the layer number 2 now, the one that's got the black square in it, so our very top layer, hover over that, hover over the thumbnail, hold down the Command key and click, it'll load that as a selection again. So again, not only do we load selections as channels, as paths, you can actually load a layer as a selection as well. So what it's done is that if you turn off the white background layer on the bottom, it knows the areas here that are transparent, and it knows the areas that are not transparent, and it built a selection based on that. So I'm going to go back down to my black layer. I'm going to make the black layer active. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the eyeball for the white one, but you can't see it because I've turned on the black layer. I want to invert this selection now. I want the opposite. I don't want to make another selection of the square that's in the middle. Instead, I want everything that's around it. That is not invert Command I. If you hit Command I to invert right now, you'll see what happens is it just turns the black into white. That's an inversion of either the color or tone. That's not what I want to do. What I want to do is invert the selection, and to do that you go up to the Select menu and you come down to Inverse. And when that happens, you'll notice that the marching ants that are in the center don't change at all, but you get a second set of marching ants that are going around the perimeter of the image right now. And it's showing that we've selected the sort of exterior. We've selected the donut, not the hole. Make sense? Okay. Still working on my black layer right here. So my black layer is active. I'm going to jump this to its own layer, Command J. Then I'm going to turn off the black layer and I'm going to turn on both the top layers, and you can see that the image itself is black. And the reason it's black is because those edges perfectly aligned with one another. So again, the minute I turn that on, those edges, they're perfectly aligned together. And that happens when we work with 100% opacities. That's what's really going on here. So, does that make sense, everybody? This works the way you think things should work in Photoshop. Are we good on this part?
Mine says it can't make a new layer because the selected area is empty.
Then it depends on what layer you're trying to select.
I'm on layer 2.
So you're on the black layer. Which one did you select? You should have selected the one that was actually jumped. Here, let me go back in time.
Yeah, I was on that one.
So I'm just going to do this from the beginning. I've got a black layer. I've made a selection, Command J to jump it to its own layer.
Yeah.
Then if I turn off, you don't have to turn off anything. You just need to hover over the thumbnail of that small rectangle that was jumped. Hold down your Command key and click, and it loads it as a selection.
Yeah.
So what didn't load?
Okay. And then I just go to enter.
So then up to the select menu, down to inverse, which is an inversion of the selection. That will give you marching ants around the exterior as well.
Yeah, it still did that. I don't know.
It did what?
It just says it cannot make a new layer from the selection.
All right, so just go ahead and say OK. All right, so you're not on this. You're coming back down to this guy now because we're now going to jump this to its own layer, which you just did. And that's perfect. You don't need to move it. It's perfect where it is. Turn off the black. Good. And because you've moved this now, that's why you get that little white line. But if you turn off the eyeball, you see that. Turn it back on, and then turn off the eyeball on the top one. And you see that they actually fit perfectly. Make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Cursor?
Yeah.
Is it supposed to do that?
Okay, so everybody's getting this small little line around it. The line that you're getting around it, or not everybody, but some people, in Jared's case, it's a line that runs just along the top. In Amanda's case, it's the edge at the top and down on the side. It's because of the way your screen is drawing right now. So in Photoshop, if you take a look at your zoom level down here at the bottom, you'll actually see there are only specific zoom levels that truly work in terms of giving you pixel level accuracy. So 100% will do it, 50% usually will do it, 25% will also do it. However, your zoom, what's your zoom level on the bottom lower corner? Yeah, so it's take it to 50% and see what happens. Go to 100%. Yep. So the only true drawing is at 100%. Photoshop has to fake it when it's trying to show you a zoom of 33% or 28.5%, whatever. It's kind of an illusion. But anyway, that's what's going on. True, did you have a question?
No.
Okay. All right. Okay, so this works the way everybody thinks it should work in Photoshop. However, we're going to do a different version of this. I'm going to hit Command D to deselect. I'm going to throw away the two layers. You can keep the black and white layer, but you don't need to actually keep the square or you don't need to keep the original donut or the original hole. In this case now, still working with the marquee tool, I'm going to change the feathering of this. I'm going to bump the feathering up to 20 pixels. And all that does is just gives us a softer edge. I'm going to still do the exact same thing I did before. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag out a square or a rectangle that's sort of in the middle. You can see that my corners now are rounded over. That's due to the feathering that I just installed into this. But I'm going to do the same thing I did before. Command J. to jump that to its own layer. If you turn off the black layer right now, you can see that it's a selection that's made with a soft feathered edge. So what happens in the feathering now, unlike our original one where there was no feathering at all, we actually go from a pure white through a series of grays ultimately, I'm sorry, from pure black through a series of grays ultimately to a white. If you zoom in really tight on the edge, you can see what feathering is and what blurring actually is that it just introduces tones of gray between the white and the black. So again, in this area down in here, it's pure black. In the area up at the very top, it's pure white. There's a transition though that's being introduced in here. That's what feathering does. That's what blurring does. That's everything that's going on in here. So we're going to do the same trick that we did before. I'm going to double click on the hand just to zip back out. I'm going to hover over the thumbnail of this little square. I'm going to hold down the Command key and click. That loads it as a selection. I'm going to then go up to the select menu and come down to inverse. Now that's got marching ants around the exterior as well. I'm going to go back to my black layer. I'm going to turn it on and I'm going to jump this to its own layer, Command J, and then turn off the black layer. And what you'll see that actually happens in here is you get this. This is the dovetailing problem. So what's happening here is, it's going to be easier to see this on the whiteboard. So just to explain what's really going on here. So in that sort of edge that you're looking at, that shadowy part that you're looking at, I'm going to draw that up here. So let's just imagine it looks like this. What happened is that the area that's in here is pure black. The area that's in here is pure white. This transition area in here goes from 100% right here, which is pure black, to roughly 0% right here, which is pure white. And then here in the middle, I've got like 50%. When you overlay two transparencies in Photoshop, it actually doesn't add them. It looks at what the product of that would be. So this area that is in the middle right here is going to be 50% of 50%. And that equals 25%. Most people would say, oh, it's a 50% plus 50% equals 100%. That's not how Photoshop works. Does that make sense what's going on here? So this area, you can actually see the readout of it. If you zoom in on this pretty close, we're looking for the exact middle range of this. So what you'll see right here in the very middle, if you take a look up at my info palette right here, it's reading 64, 64, 64s. That's 25%. If you look at the scale of 0 to 255, 256 tones, a quarter of that is 64, and that's what you're getting right here. So again, when it does transparency, it's saying, okay, well, you called for 50% transparency in the initial feathering, and now you've actually done the donut on top of it that was also at 50%. So again, it's not that you are subtracting 50 from 50 and you get 0. It doesn't turn out to be black. It actually ends up doing 50% of 50%, and you end up with this residual 25%. So that's what explains the dovetailing. If you take a look at the dovetailing that we were just looking at right here, that's what's happening right here. This edge right here, it's based on the fact that the layer mask that is that's holding back the sweater has got tone as it starts to roll off onto the skin. It's actually not a perfectly cut out line, and then the skin on its way back is doing the same thing. It's a softer edge. So if we take a look at the sweater, you can see that there's a softness to this edge. It's not perfectly cut, and it's that transparency as it starts to move towards the skin that's being met with the same thing coming back. If we take a look at the skin instead, you get the same transparency that's going back, and where those two things intersect, you end up with this dovetail issue right here. Does this make sense to everybody what's going on? So, yes? I'm sorry? So to fix it, you actually have to pick which one you want to dominate. You would have to go in here and say, okay, you can either pick the skin or you can pick the sweater, but you can't have both. And then you would have to do it all with handwork. Again, most of the time when we're actually trying to do a composite and we're actually trying to lift the figure off a background and put them onto a separate background, you actually want a softer edge. If you have a harder edge, it's exactly what I tried to get away from in the assignment that you guys just finished that was due today, is that the reason that once you made your selection using the pen tool and loaded it as a selection and then feathered it was to give you a softer edge so it doesn't look like it's been cut out. Most of the work like this is actually used to go in and recolor this stuff, and that selection doesn't have to be as perfect as you think it needs to be. So we're going to look at that today, and then you can kind of decide. But rarely do you run into this dovetailing problem unless you're trying to do stuff like this. But again, this is not compositing work per se. We're not trying to like pull this sweater out and put it by itself somewhere else. Okay. So before are there any questions about this so far? Are we good? All right. Before we actually launch into doing Sunny again in class, I want to talk about our final project, because that's actually, not that it's coming up immediately, but I need you to start thinking about your final project now. I know it seems like, are you kidding me? You're asking me to start thinking about it right now? However, if you take a look at our website, I'm going into week 5. That's hard to believe, but we are in week 5. So one of the assignments is to actually redo assignment 3.1. That's the Sunny one. That's the one we're going to start here in class. There is another image I'm going to actually ask you to do a complete knockout on. You can read the assignment. It's pretty self-evident. And then the right final project proposal. So if you could actually click on this, if you can jump into our website just to make sure that everybody understands what's going on in here. So again, the purpose of this assignment is to just get you thinking about what you're going to do for your final project in this class. So to give you some idea of what I expect, that's why I want to go over this part right here. So what I'm asking you to write, only 2 paragraphs. That's all I really care about. The first paragraph should be the conceptual part of your proposal. What is it that you're really planning on doing? The second paragraph are the logistics of it. Are you going to be starting in the studio and then shooting outside? Are you working on images that you made 5 years ago? Are you going to harvest imagery from online sources only? Or, I mean, what is it? That's kind of what's going on in here. But the thing I think that's the most important here is this part right here, the things to keep in mind. So your final project is supposed to be an integration of the stuff that you've learned in this class as it applies to your own personal work. The one thing I do not want, Mikhail, can you start me signing? The one thing I do not want you to do in this class is a final project that is strictly to fulfill the assignment that you don't care about other than getting your grade and then you're out of here. That seems to me tragically short-sighted. What I really am hoping you will be able to do is to take the skills that you have learned in this class and apply it to your own work, hopefully work that's destined for your portfolio. That, if you were to ask me, the one thing I care about the most about all of you in every class that you have here is that you're doing work that's heading towards your portfolio, because your portfolio is your ticket out. So I need you to think about it in those terms. So for some people, that means that there isn't going to be, again, your final project doesn't have to be retouching, it doesn't have to be compositing, it doesn't have to be color correct, it doesn't have to be any of those things. It just needs to be whatever you got from this class that you can apply to your work. Does that make sense to everybody, what's going on here? that applying to your work is really a critical part for me in this. So to that end, it can be a menagerie of things. So most of your final projects and most of your classes have been project oriented, right? Oh, I did this body of work for this, for my final project here, and here all these images relate. You can walk into this class and have one composited image, one beauty image retouched, one food shot that you retouch. I mean, it can be all over the place. That's not what I care about. I care about your portfolio. That's what I care about. Make sense? Everybody asks me how many images to do for your final project. It all depends on the how involved the retouching or the whatever it is you're doing to the images are, right? I had a student here, true story. You know the moose mural that's on the back here, the moose blowing. So the guy who actually shot that picture was in my class, and he came to his final project and he said, "I only have a single image," and I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, let's take a look at it." It's an image that he'd been working on for 6 months straight. It had over 30,000 layers. And if you looked at it, you could tell that he had spent months of work on this thing. How can I say to somebody, okay, you've spent 4 months solid working on this image, but that doesn't count as a final? It did. Is that sort of? So what I say to all of you is that you've all done this long enough. You know what's final worthy and what isn't. You know when you're trying to slide and when you're not. And if you have any questions about it, ask me, talk to me. Once we hit like week 10 or 11 here, we start looking at work in progress. So we'll get a pretty good idea of what's going on as far as that part goes. Whatever you put in this paragraph or 2 paragraphs that you're going to submit in the next, so you have 2 weeks to do this, I think that's 2 weeks for the deadline for this. It's not a contract. You do not, all of a sudden you get into week 9 or 10 and you say, wow, I hate that idea. I don't want to do that at all. Something else has happened in your work and you're saying my work's going in a whole new direction and I want to do this, whatever. I'm fine with that. The only reason I do this early in the game is that I don't want you waiting until week number 13 to do your final project in a week. Make sense? We good? All right. So take a look through this. If there's anything that's, however, the last thing I'll say about this really quickly, just to plant this seed in your mind as well, is it's the only thing that we will print in this class is your final project. It will go up on these boards and we will do a full critique of that on our final class. That being said, to help give us some sense of what it is you really did do to those images, final critiques in this class consist of before and after images. So let's say you're doing a composite. You'll have your final composite will be on the wall, and then just small samples of images the isolated elements that you use to build the composite. Does that sort of make sense? If you're doing a retouching, sort of a before and after the retouching part, I mean, you guys get this part, right? So just to give everybody some idea of what it is you really did. Because if you do it really, really well, nobody should know. Questions about this part? All right, really quickly, I want to show you just some examples of work that's happened here before. I'm not going to spend hours on this because we got a lot to do, but I do want to show you just some ideas of stuff that other people have done. Let me get this a little bit bigger. Okay, that's as big as it's going to go. So this was a guy, Alex Mortel, who was really interested in shooting architecture, but he was also really interested in sort of perverting the whole idea of architecture. So he ended up doing, these were beautiful giant prints, whatever, but he like closed all the windows in all these buildings, whatever. He like shut them up and he turned them into these sort of like 2-dimensional planes. This stuff was really, really beautifully well done. Austin created his own sort of like world. So these are all composited. The buildings actually don't exist. These buildings themselves are composited. He created the buildings out of other buildings and then dropped them into these like landscapes. I thought some of these were better than some others. This one and the first one I thought were actually really well done. This starts to be a slightly cartoonish, but nonetheless, it was still a really good idea. Sean, this was actually, his stuff right here was sort of more the typical, what you would call compositing work. So this is the completed composite right here. This was the space that he shot, and this was what he ended up doing in the studio to create that. There's other ones. So this was, again, his background. This was what he shot in the studio, and this was his composite together. So he was doing interesting things like this and the composite part together. And his stuff was actually very well done. Devin took this to the next level. So this is a composite of, I can't even begin, well, here, I'm going to open this one up really quickly just so you have a chance, not because it's grotesque, but, so Devin actually managed to find an ambulance, like a fire station, EMT ambulance situation, whatever, that agreed to allow him to photograph the interior of their ambulances. But all of these figures are individually shot in the studio. This couple right here they're shot separately. And he actually managed to put that arm around her and pull it in and connect them, whatever. I mean, it was just unbelievably well done. But he also really explored the whole idea. He had notes and maps about all his perspectives on all of this. I mean, the reason this thing ends up being as successful as it is that his planning was just extraordinary. So, but this image is made out, this image that we're looking at, there's probably 20 elements in this image to pull together this composite. The exterior out of the backgrounds are all fake. He shot the ambulance during the day. I mean, and again, the figures were all shot in the studio. Anyway, it was just nuts, nuts, nuts. Some of Devin's other work, some better than others. He had this whole story about how and why he shot all these things, but at any rate. Eric did sort of more of the, I don't know, I want to say sort of, fantastical, kind of romantic, dreamy sort of, that kind of work here. I mean, this is what he was sort of like interested in doing. Again, I thought some of these more successful than others, but you can see here, this doesn't necessarily relate to this one as well. It's not like this unified body of work, and that part's fine. Again, that's not something that I'm actually looking for. So Haley was into doing food, and so again, it's pretty self-evident what she's doing in here and how she's sort of doing in here. I think, ironically, that her retouching in here was better than her photography. I think her photography could have been cleaner and stronger to actually start with. But I could appreciate the sort of narrative that she was doing here, the sense of time that she's drawing into all of this. This is the guy that I was telling you. So this is the guy who actually did the Moose poster. He was into really doing these, he's very, say this the correct way, Jacob is very sensitive about the global political situation that we find ourselves in, but also that has been the case for mankind for all its history, whatever. So he was really captivated by the idea of focusing on children during war. And so you run into things like this. So he made these like giant, almost like poster-like things, but this was the kind of retouching that he was sort of doing, and this sort of in many ways would be like the cover of his book. Again, it was this whole idea of war and children and how that impacted them and all that. So anyway, this was the sort of stuff that he was doing in here, and you can see some of this stuff just becomes, incredibly abstract. Anyway, they were really, I thought, really sort of interesting, provocative pieces. This was actually, Jeff, all of these were created, let me actually open up one of these. I mean, these are very M.C. Escher kind of plays on perspective. And all of this was created with found imagery. So he actually went online and he found big hunks of grass, and then he found big hunks of dirt, whatever. But then he actually put all these things together in these impossible perspective situations. And they were really extremely well done. They were pretty compelling. So I guess the point that I'm trying to stress in all of this clearly is that this is not about you doing necessarily fashion and beauty imagery. Jeff, these were actually some of the most, I'm going to open up one of these, incredibly interesting imagery things that he did. I think he did this for Constructed Image. That was sort of the other class that he was working with at the same time. But what he did was these were actually pieces of foam core. So this whole thing right here is just a piece of foam core that has been cut so that it actually has dimensionality. You know, I mean, even though foam core has a small amount of depth, he cut and folded these things to get them really create this strong sense of depth. And then he actually took single images and went in Photoshop and actually mapped those images, that image, to this form, and then relit the entire thing. So you can see this image right here as it moves from this plane, into this plane right here, the lighting shifts because the lighting in his three-dimensional sculpture shifted. These were, I've seen a lot of complex stuff done, but this definitely up at the top level of some of the most complex stuff, because you're not only dealing with the planes, but you're actually having to then transform every single one of these planes. Every single one of these has actually been transformed to actually fit onto that piece of foam core, and then to have the entire thing relit and then shadows thrown in on top of that. It was just, I mean, it was just, they were mind-numbing in a good way. Almost done here. So you don't have access to this anymore. I'm going to open both of these up. But at one time, Columbia owned the old Johnson Publishing building. You know that really brutalist building that's right on Michigan Avenue, sort of almost at 9th. It's all like blocky concrete. That's sort of a ugly kind of brownish tone. You guys know the building I'm talking about? That was the Johnson Publishing building. So Johnson's Publishing were the people who did Ebony, who did, anyway, he was like this gigantic African-American figure here in Chicago and had this publishing business, and that was the building that it all came out of. When Johnson published, I can't remember his first name. Anyway, he died, his wife died, and the building sat empty for a really long time, and Columbia ended up buying it, and then Columbia ended up selling it. But nonetheless, these were pictures that were taken in the Johnson building before they were, when we still had access to them. And so if you take a look at this, the thing that was amazing about it is that it was built in the 70s, and it never changed. So when you went in there, all of the stuff from the 70s was still there. So anyway, this girl was really fascinated by shooting these architectural pictures in here. So if you take a look at this, you say, well, so big deal. It's an architectural shot of the interior of this building. However, this is what it looked like when she was there. So you say, well, that's not that big of a deal, even though she's actually squared up the building and turned on the lights and opened up the entire part of the room that was not. Take a look at this corner up here. There's a piece of glass, which is, again, very tricky stuff to work with. There's a whole pane of glass that's curved glass that's sticking out. It's fallen out of its track, and she put it back in. I mean, this was nuts. This was really crazy when she first showed this. I'll show you another one here really quickly. And this just is a testament to how tenacious she actually was in all of this. So again, when you take a look at this, it actually looks, well, that looks pretty good, right? If you take a look at the original though, sorry. So she did not bother to pick up all the shit on the floor. She actually left it there to retouch it out. Look at all this pattern. She has to, retouching pattern, you have to match it up with the original pattern. This is a fucking nightmare. Look at her layer stack right here. I just want to show you this. It was just really impressive, what she ended up doing with this. But this is her layer stack. So she starts out, and she goes in and she does some transform to square things up. Then take a look at her carpet group. This is her carpet group. Inside her carpet group is this, the vertical and the horizontal part. Look at this. And that's only part of it. This is the midsection part of it. And this is the blinds on the bottom part of it. Look at this. So when you say, well, okay, and this is just part of it. We haven't gotten to the walls or so how many images, What if you're doing this kind of work, you do not need to do 15 of these. Make sense? All right. Almost done.
If you're thinking of doing composites or some retouching for commercial too, can you use some of those for this class as well?
Absolutely. So I get this all the time. And there's people who here is in my fashion class? Anybody? Who is in my, JP, my commercial class. Yeah, so there's a lot of times that things overlap. Here's the trick, it's fine, but there's 2 requirements for it. So if you're gonna use the same work for 2 classes, number one, especially for finals, number one, it has to be 2 finals worth of work, so that if the administration comes back and says, well, show me the work, it needs to look like, okay, this was enough to satisfy 2 completely separate finals worth of work. Make sense? And the other thing is that you need to get the permission of both instructors to do it. But I let people do it all the time. I think it's actually a very smart thing. Almost done here. I'm going to show you just a couple. So this would be the more sort of typical what you would kind of expect in this class. So again, a more fashion beauty approach. So Josh was a fashion shooter, so this is what he did. But you can see the level that he's actually taking his retouching to. So again, no small feat in all of this. Let me show you one other really quickly. And again, sort of before and after. And I got 2 others to show you, and then we'll move on. So Kai was one of the, I've only had 3 or 4 graduate students in this class, actually, who are grad students. And I think this is the layered file, so I should be able to show you the before and after part. Anyway, Kai was a grad student, and he was really interested in shooting architecture and landscapes. That was his thing. And so this is where he ended up. That's where he started. Yeah. Insane. I mean, building the lawn, insanity. Relighting the building, the whole 9 yards, whatever. It was just, I have sort of followed him somewhat. He does really, 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 really beautiful work. Let's see if I got one other to show. The church one is not quite as dramatic as this, but you'll still get some sense. Yeah. Okay, and one last one to show you. Oh, actually I lied, 2. Terry was really into shooting cars. So this was unfortunately I don't have the befores and afters. But if you take a look at these, you know, pretty impressive, right? So he shot all these sort of industrial locations around the city that he loved. This is a toy car that's this big. Yeah. But he really, I mean, he got, you know, again, to be able to not only reconstruct the shadows on the ground to actually anchor this into its space, but also recreate the shadows and the highlights on the car to explain the lighting in the space. I mean, it was just, this stuff was nuts. And then one last one to show you. Actually, two last ones to show you. So this is Tim. Tim actually is got a pretty seriously successful, thriving retouching company here in Chicago. He does this for a living now. So this is Tim. This is what he started with. And this is where he ended up. Crazy, right? And one last one, because again, it sort of gives you a sense of the possibilities and how broad they really are. So this is Harith, and Harith was, let's get the story here. Harith was Palestinian, and there was a huge number of places in the Middle East that he was forbidden to go to because he was Palestinian. So he composited himself into all of those spaces. But when he did this, so when he actually showed his final project, so I mean, you know, the composite work, you know, he matched things pretty well. I mean, he pulled it off actually, that part pretty well, but he turned these things into postcards. And so they were, his whole final project were these postcards of him in these forbidden places. And it was just the whole, everything behind it, the idea behind it, the execution of it, all of it, you know, it just spoke to something that mattered to him. And I loved that part of it all. Again, I thought that was, for me, that's what I'm hoping I see and that I get from you guys, the stuff that you're passionate about, and that, you know, hopefully is going to help build a future for you, however that plays out. So are there questions about this part? Are we good on this? Okay, it is 2 o'clock. Let's do a hard 10-minute break, and then we're going to jump into Sunny. I need everybody kind of awake, so go grab coffee or a Coke or something. Oh, yeah, and I'm going to show, there's a lot of people who are asking what got turned in. So hang on one second.